materials. We don't care about the labor.
Claudia, I'm blaming you. Claudia, I'm blaming you for being late. You walked into this conversation, so I can't help you out on this one.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Good morning, Claudia.
Sorry, guys, this morning.
It's all right, Congresswoman Claudia.
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning. I don't know what you're getting into.
No, that's perfectly.
We were talking about why, without the internet and iPhones and all that stuff back in hundreds of years ago, how did they pass time so much? And apparently it took a long. They built pyramids and castles, and it took a long time.
You know what? I apologize. I blame myself for letting the conversation, I guess, go there. I'm kidding. I'm just.
Well, apparently it wasn't hundreds of years ago, because when I was young, we didn't have any of that. And I remember the excitement of getting the console TV that had color. It was like a big deal. You know?
Claudia, I remember going to my neighbors. When we were kids, we went to one of the neighbors and looked through their picture window. Because they had color TV and nobody else did.
Who's that creepy kid peeking through? Or even taking $1 and going to get a comic book from the grocery store was an exciting thing when you were like 10 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a whole different world. I mean, I remember our family, we had one car. My mother used to drive my father to work, and then, she'd go drive us around. We'd go to school, and then she'd pick us up, and he had all the sports and everything else.
You got picked up, we had to walk.
That's because those cars you could fit 3 families in back then. They were that big, Claudia. So.
Well, unfortunately for me, I lived so far from school. It was we don't have any sidewalks back in those days. It's about 7. I live about as far as from my high school as you can be, almost, and still be able to attend New Hartford schools. I live in the outer end of it. So, but no, and then we all learned how to drive eventually. That was always dangerous too.
Did you pass your? Did you get your or pass your driving test on the first try, Claudia?
Yes, I don't even remember. I think I did. I mean, I had to get driving because I had to drive every day to go to Cazenovia because I used to show horses and ride, and the barn that I rode at was in Nelson. And so it was a lot. I picked my sister up and we drove there every day.
Claudia, let's start off with something from last week that we didn't. We can circle back to quick, and then we'll get into some of the latest news. But last week, holding a forum of some sort for small banks at SUNY. How did that come about, and how did that play out? I guess towards.
It was really great. I was so pleased that so many banks showed up. We had a good mix. We had some larger banks, some medium-sized banks, and some medium-sized banks, and some local banks, and some credit unions, all talking about the package that was passed recently in the House, actually made into law, and really excited that 2 of those bills, of course, are mine, which were targeted at small banks. As everybody knows who's telling the truth, there is nothing really in this package for bigger banks. They're happy that smaller banks are getting an advantage, and, the Democrats and my opponent keep just saying, we help the big banks. It's really not true. We've done nothing really to protect big banks. This package was aimed at the small banks because one of the problems with Dodd-Frank is Dodd-Frank was that big sweeping legislation that came in after the financial crisis and put in all these restrictions and reforms, most of which really didn't do anything to address any of the problems of the financial crisis, which really was all surrounded by government-backed securities. And we could loop Andrew Cuomo into that and talk about some of the blame for it. But back to what we're trying to do is roll back some areas where small banks have been in a great disadvantage. They've not been able to do loans. And some of the facts are we've lost almost 3,000 small and community banks since the Dodd-Frank regulations were passed. And we want to continue to grow the small banks because they're the ones that make most of the loans to small businesses, to the homeowner that wants to buy their starter home, to the car, the car buyer who needs a car to go to work, used or new, whatever. And so these are the smaller institutions that are really closer to home, closer to their customers. And we wanted to give them the one-size-fits-all solution for Dodd-Frank has caused them to disappear, and there's less opportunity for consumers. So what we did is work with a lot of the banks and roll back some of the regulations that have really amounted to nothing but paperwork and have prohibited small banks from loaning.
How important
this is going to be good in the future.
How important is that to farmers, local farmers?
Well, something like 78% of loans that go to local farmers come from small banks. So we've put farmers at a disadvantage, when you have to work with a real large or a national bank. And just think about it. Think about how banking has changed. We have wonderful small banks in our community. Remember, I used to represent Homestead Savings. We have the Bank of Utica. Remember Herkimer County Trust. We have Tioga Bank in the Southern Tier.
Well, Savings Bank of
Bank.
You had the Savings Bank of Utica that was local.
So many of these banks
they're all gone.
They're forced into consolidation. Really unique banks like Bank of Utica have been able to survive, really well managed, good bank. But those are when you could actually go into the bank and you knew the loan officer and you knew the people at the bank, like you can at the Bank of Utica and Adirondack Bank. But, now what we've done, what Dodd-Frank did is put us all on the 800 line, and we have these banks, these mega banks. And it was actually the opposite of what the goal of Dodd-Frank was. We actually made banks bigger and made them really too big to fail. And our smaller banks were too small to save. Right. And so we want to make sure we keep the smaller banks. It's been, it's just they're very small changes, but they're enough that they're going to make a difference. A small bank not having to go through the exam cycle, for example, what they have to go through with federal regulators, instead of doing it every 18 months instead of every 12 months, it saves enough money that they can actually make more loans or hire a few more people. So a lot of it is compliance costs, and you could relate this directly to small businesses that have a lot of one-size-fits-all regulations put on them, and they can't compete. Perfect example, some of the smaller coffee shops like Daylight Donuts or Dippin' Donuts, they can't compete with Dunkin' Donuts because Dunkin' Donuts is a big chain that has the economy of scale. When they buy coffee or when they buy cups or when they buy their equipment, they buy it in bulk, and it's a lot cheaper, where a smaller specialty store doesn't have that kind of flexibility, and they can't afford to compete with the bigger guys. And that's what we've done. Look at our community. We used to have all these small, locally owned and operated businesses, upstarts, and we've lost so many of them to these big chain stores and to these bigger entities. And that's what overregulation does. It doesn't actually protect the small business person or the entrepreneur. It actually protects the big guys and keeps them from having competition, and that's the opposite of what we want to do.
Congresswoman Claudia Tenney joining us here on the Talk of the Town, Talk 100.7 FM. I did want to get that in there. I know that was something.
Thank you. No, it was a big day, and actually I'm going to the White House today for another big bill that we got done. It was on veterans and helping veterans smooth out and make the accountability and improve their access to care and efficiencies with the Veterans Mission Act today. So it's a good act. It was sponsored by Phil Rowe, who is a physician. Also, I believe he's also a former service member. So we're really making big strides with veterans, and we're really starting to make things happen. And this is a huge problem. Our office spends a lot of time and a lot of energy on trying to help veterans navigate through the VA. And the VA, although there's many good people that work in the VA, it's just an enormity and the enormous nature of this bureaucracy that just denies a lot of our veterans access to the care they need. Once they get the care, they're usually pretty good, but we've just got to continue to fight and improve.
Claudia, this is good news for veterans along with everyone else, and this is interesting statistic that came out this morning, that for the first time since they've been keeping records, there are now more jobs available than there are job seekers. And they've been keeping these records for about 20 years. That's the first time that's happened. And I think a lot of people believe that goes back to the tax cuts. And right now, the unemployment rate is under 4%, and by economists consider 4% full employment because of natural changes in the economy. So if you look at the economy, and also the NASDAQ, that's the index that keeps track of more of the technology stocks, that again reached record highs yesterday. And I think a lot of people are looking at the tax cuts that were responsible for this improvement in the economy. I think that the Democrats are going to have a hard time in the elections, because that's something that's probably as important to people as anything else. And the Democrats said that this tax cut would be a disaster, and it hasn't been a disaster in any respect.
No, they keep saying it, and it's interesting. I keep running into people. I don't even bother asking when I do business roundtables and meet with businesses. I've yet to meet anyone that isn't seeing benefits. And remember, some of these business owners might own properties, and they're not getting as much on their state and local tax deduction as they did before, but they're seeing benefits in other ways. And we're trying to make these permanent, and we're trying to make them even deeper and stronger. But isn't it great that we have all these jobs and a lot of people? Now the big mission is to get all these able-bodied people who don't have children to get to work, don't have dependents, get them an opportunity to go get a job and to get out and be self-sustaining. And it's a huge opportunity, and it's something that one of the other complaints is they love the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, whether it's an individual run into teachers and corrections officers and pizza stores and bigger manufacturing firms